Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. This presentation is based on a walking tour that I created a few years ago about holiday history in New York City. And when I do the walking tour, we begin in Madison Square Park and we end around Union Square. But by doing it in this format, I'm actually able to take you throughout the entire city, like Michelle said. And I can show you a lot of really awesome historic images and things that we wouldn't have been able to see had we been walking around. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm currently the managing editor at 6squarefeet.com, and we write about basically everything New York City, current events, history, architecture, preservation. But I actually got my start at the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, now called Village Preservation. And we shared an office with HDC. So I've known Michelle for a long time. And I'm really happy to be with all of you this evening. So let's get started. And what I'm going to tell you, oops, give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. So what I will tell you all to begin is that Christmas became a national holiday in the United States in 1870. And that date is important and interesting because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today actually predates that. There was an article in the New York Post a few years ago, and I think the title of it was something like, Christmas was born in New York City. And, I loved that title because I think that's really true. And I think, at the end of this lecture tour today, you'll see that so much of what we associate with the modern holiday season actually had roots right here in New York City. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are Christmas trees. So Christmas trees were their first incarnation was when pagans in Europe brought in branches of evergreen fir trees to decorate their homes during the winter solstice. But it's really Germany that is credited with starting the Christmas tree tradition as we know it. In the 16th century, devout Christians started to bring evergreen trees into the home. And they would decorate them with gingerbread, nuts, and apples. The kind of that really classic look that we all know. And it's commonly believed that the 16th century Protestant reformer Martin Luther was the first to add lighted candles to a tree. And the way the story goes is that he was walking home one winter evening, composing a sermon in his head, and he looked up at the night sky and he saw all the beautiful twinkling lights amongst the evergreen trees. And he thought how he wanted to recreate this magical scene for his family. And so when he got home, he strung lighted candles on a wire and put them on the family's Christmas tree. Probably not advisable to do today, but nonetheless, the custom became popular and started to spread across the royal courts and in the nobility classes in Europe. And the first documented Christmas tree in the United States was in the 1830s. It was in Pennsylvania, and it was put up by German settlers, which makes sense. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, there was a large wave of German immigration to New York City in the 1840s and through 1860s. At that time, what we now know as the East Village was called Kleindeutschland, and they had the largest German-speaking population outside of Vienna and Berlin. So you can imagine how quickly this Christmas tree tradition started spreading. But at that point in time in New York City, in order to obtain a Christmas tree, you needed a horse and carriage or wagon like we see in this photo here. Now, not everyone was able to have a horse and a carriage, so it was really only the wealthy people who were able to get out of the city and get a tree. And keep that point in mind. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. So in the year 1851, there was a Catskills farmer and woodsman named Mark Carr. Interestingly, he didn't even celebrate Christmas, but he saw how people from New York City were coming upstate to buy trees during the holidays. So he thought, well, here's a business opportunity. So a couple of weeks before Christmas in 1851, He and his sons chopped down a couple dozen fir and spruce trees, loaded them onto 2 ox sleds, and brought them into Manhattan on a ferry. They set up shop in the Washington Market, which was on the corner of Greenwich and Vesey Streets, and they paid the city $1 to take up the space there. And here's another Christmas tree market. This is obviously a bit later. This is the year 1910, but this shows you the Washington Market, and it kind of shows you how these Christmas tree markets would have looked at the time. I mean, a bit different than what we see in the city today. Obviously, more trees, more spread out. But so people were so excited that they were able to get their Christmas tree without leaving the city that Mark Carr sold out of his trees within just one day. And obviously, as with any good idea, it was copied the next year by a lot of other farmers who also started setting up their Christmas tree shops in the city. So by the 1870s, there were boatloads of evergreen trees coming into New York, even from as far as Maine at this point. And there's a New York Times article from 1800 that says, "It is safe to say that 200,000 Christmas trees will be on the market here this year, besides many tons of Christmas greens." So this really started exploding. And trees at the time cost between $8 and $10, which is about $200 today. So again, you still were a bit limited in who was able to afford a tree at this time. But getting back to Mark Carr, he became known as the Vanderbilt of Christmas trees. And he was setting up his market for decades. And it's believed that as late as 1898, his sons were still selling Christmas trees. Here's another image of a Christmas tree market. This is 1903, down by the World Trade Center site. And here's a bit later on Catherine Street on the Lower East Side. And what you can see here is that we have Christmas trees set up on the sidewalk, which is a bit more like what we're used to today. So what happened with Christmas tree markets is that in the 1930s, Mayor LaGuardia started establishing different regulations that would reduce street peddling and make vendors apply for permits. So this was around the time when he was setting up markets like the Essex Market. And the idea was to mainly it was food, to get vendors off the street and into more regulated indoor environments for sanitary reasons and what have you. But Christmas tree vendors got grouped into this. However, people were not happy about this. They loved their Christmas tree markets. And so in 1938, the city council adopted what became known as the Coniferous tree exception, which allows vendors to sell and display Christmas trees on a New York City sidewalk without a permit during the month of December. But they do have to have permission of the storefront owners who they're setting up in front of. And of course, they have to leave space for people to walk by on the sidewalk. So throughout the 1930s, all of the Christmas tree markets were centered along West Street, which made sense. That's where the boats were pulling in that could easily transport the trees. But once the docks stopped operating in the 1950s, that's when you really started to see the Christmas tree markets spread throughout the entire city. And now that coniferous tree exception that I mentioned is still in effect today. But what that has done, because you're not paying the city, it's led to really stiff competition amongst vendors as to where they can set up. Obviously, certain locations are more prime than others. Being right near a subway station is ideal. I imagine being outside the Trader Joe's is ideal. So there's a lot of competition. There's rumors of people paying people off. And the other thing this has led to is that the price of Christmas trees in the city have more than doubled in the past 10 years, which I'm sure a lot of you have realized when you've gone out to buy a tree. Last year, there was a big story about Soho Trees, which is located near Canal Street, and they were selling 20-foot Fraser fir trees for $6,500. I do believe this included delivery and installation, but nonetheless, I feel like every year now there's a story of some exorbitantly priced Christmas tree. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the nation's first public Christmas tree. And this has a lot to do with the point I made about Christmas trees in one's home really being reserved for the wealthy. So what you're looking at here is, like I said, the nation's first public Christmas tree in Madison Square Park, which went up in 1912. So Madison Square Park at this time was a very affluent area, but it was also a very commercial area. So, it was a perfect place for this because you really had people of all walks of life passing through. And the idea came from a woman named Emily D. Herreshoff, and she was 49 years old at the time, and her husband was a prominent chemical scientist. And she was involved with a lot of social causes related to the city's poor. And so she had this idea that by putting up a public Christmas tree, it would allow those who aren't fortunate enough to have one in their home, it would allow them the opportunity to take part in the festivities, bring their children to see a tree. And she really wanted it to be a family type of event. And so she petitioned the mayor at the time, William Gaynor, and he eventually approved the plan. And the Adirondack Club donated the tree, and then the transportation costs to get it down from the Adirondacks was actually covered by an anonymous railroad worker. So on December 21st of 1912, this 60-foot tall tree that you're seeing here arrived by a horse-drawn truck, and it got decorated with 2,300 colored electric bulbs that were donated by the Edison Company. And this is a fun photo because you can see the scaffolding where it's being decorated. And here's another great photo of it. And you can, if you do look closely, you can see kind of how it's being tethered with strings to be held upright. And this is a snippet from a New York Times article describing the tree. Not seen in this, but this is a great quote. It says, "It is hoped by those who have worked for it and hope to personify in it the great Christmas spirit that the placing of a great outdoor Christmas tree may become a national custom, taking the place in America of the older customs of older lands." So the idea was that this would really catch on and become part of the New York holiday season. And it certainly did, because on Christmas Eve of that year, 25,000 people came out for the country's first public Christmas tree lighting. And this is a photo of that here. So a Star of Bethlehem was placed atop the tree. There were local choirs that were singing carols. And then at midnight, they sang the song America, which ended the festivities. And then the lights were shut off, but they were illuminated every night that year until New Year's Eve. And if you go to the south end of Madison Square Park today, you'll see what I'm showing you here, which is called the Star of Hope. This was put up in 1916. It's obviously a 5-point star, and it's set atop a 35-foot pole. And this was put up to commemorate that first public Christmas tree lighting because it was such a significant event. And it was so significant that the following year, in 1913, more than 50 cities across the country, including Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Jersey City, all put up their own public Christmas trees. So not only did this catch on as a custom in New York, but across the country as well. So one thing that surprised me when I first started learning about all of this holiday history, and I think always kind of, leaves people wondering is, well, what about the Rockefeller Center tree? I think, because that's kind of the tree, we probably think of it as the first, but as we just learned, in fact, it wasn't. And in fact, it wasn't the second, third, or fourth either. So I'm going to now take you through a few other early public Christmas trees in the city. And this is the City Hall Christmas tree that was lit in 1913. And this was actually the first municipal Christmas tree ceremony. So again, this was a very festive event. The New York City Housing Authority choir performed. People were sipping hot chocolate. The tree looks a little funny, but it sounded like it was a fun affair. in 1920, we saw a Christmas tree go up in Prospect Park. And you can see that here. It was a 40-foot Christmas tree decorated with 600 colorful electrical bulbs. And it was located near the Grand Army Plaza arch, which also used to get lit up for the holidays. In 1934, this tree was moved outside the park into Grand Army Plaza itself. In more recent years, though, it's moved back under the arch. And this is a fun little tidbit. In 2006 and 2007, the arch was not actually a tree, but a tree shape made up of 600,000 LED lights that could light up in all different colors. It only went up those 2 years, they say, because it was improperly stored. But, you know, I don't know how much of that was that people kind of just preferred their traditional tree. And then in 1923, we saw a tree go up at the Stock Exchange. There was a tree lighting, and there has been a lighting held there every year except 1973, when, because of the energy crisis, instead of traditional lights, the tree was decorated with 500 glow-in-the-dark ornaments. I unfortunately could not find a photo of that. And here's one of my personal favorites, the Washington Square Park tree. This tree went up in 1924. This is a much later photo, 1950. But it was very much the same, and very much the same as what you see today, with its location just in front of the arch. This is considered the second longest running tree lighting. And it was started on Christmas Eve of 1924 by the Washington Square Association, which is actually New York City's longest running neighborhood group. And the whole community came out. There was Christmas carols, music, again, very much like the lighting that they typically hold today. But the fun thing about this tree is that there are, you know, some people say that after that first year, the tree got planted elsewhere in the park. And the president of the Washington Square Association that year had said that he wanted New York City to have a permanently planted Yuletide evergreen like that in Washington, D.C., referring to the national Christmas tree that had gone up outside the White House the year prior. But in all of my research, I have not been able to find any evidence that it actually was replanted. But, you know, I definitely could be wrong, and it could have gone somewhere in the park. But usually this tree is about 45 feet. This is how it looks today. And it, you know, definitely an iconic shot. And now, 1931, so 19 years after that first Madison Square tree, now we see the tree go up at Rockefeller Center. But unlike all the other trees that I just told you about, this had very different origins. Whereas all the other trees were really planned by the community, or, you know, a neighborhood group to be for that community and for the city, this was actually started by construction workers at the Rockefeller Center construction site. So construction on Rockefeller Center had started the year prior in 1930. It was a huge project. It was actually the largest private building project that had ever been undertaken at the time, and it employed about 40,000 people. Now, 1931 was also during the Great Depression. So you can imagine that probably a lot of the construction workers were maybe not fortunate enough to have a tree in their homes that year. And so on Christmas Eve, they decided they would pool together some of their money and buy a Christmas tree. And that's what you're looking at here. They bought a 20-foot balsam fir tree, and they decorated it with handmade garland from their families. And they then lined up at the tree to receive their paychecks. And you can actually see that in this photo. If you look just to the left of the tree, you see a white box, and that's the box of paychecks being handed out. And then 2 years later, in 1933, a publicist from Rockefeller Center decided that they wanted to make this a permanent thing. And in that year, they held the first official tree lighting ceremony. A few years later, in 1936, that's when the ice skating rink opened. And so that year, instead of just a tree lighting ceremony, there was also a ice skating competition. And here you can see that that tree in 1936. This is the ice skating rink, and it's a little hard to see, but these are actually 2 trees instead of just one big tree. And then in 1942, we have 3 trees. So during the World Wars, the tree was still a relatively new tradition, and it really stood as a patriotic symbol for the country. So you can't see it in this photo, obviously, because it's black and white, but these 3 trees were decorated in red, white, and blue. And these actually, the reason that they're decorated the way they are is because that year, no materials needed for the war could be used. And actually in 1944, the tree had to remain completely unlit due to wartime blackout regulations. Now, the first time that the Christmas tree lighting was televised by NBC, the same network that it's been on ever since, some of you probably watched it last week, was 1951. So throughout the 1950s, this is when the tree starts to really take on the grand, highly decorated version, because everyone around the country is seeing it. But the decorations became, today it's just lights, but at that point, the decorations became more elaborate. They really wanted to kind of recreate like a giant version of what people would have in their homes. So you would see large plastic globes and garlands. And at this time, the decorations were getting so elaborate that it was taking 20 men on scaffolding 9 full days to fully decorate it. So here you can see the tree during the 50s, and you can see what I mean. If you look, you can see that, I'm not sure exactly what it's made of, but the garland is made to look like cranberries or popcorn, and it looks like there are ornaments on it. So it's kind of this giant version of the traditional American Christmas tree. So in 1951, the first time that the lighting aired on television, it was on the Kate Smith Show. And then from 1953 to 1955, it was on the Howdy Doody Show. So typically, the tree makes its way to Rockefeller Center on a giant truck bed. And here's a photo. It looks to me like it's probably from the 70s of the tree making its journey. And there are different, regulations about the size, and they know exactly how large it can be in order to fit around the corners and down the street. But there were 2 times that the tree came via a different mode of transportation. In 1977, it came on a barge down the Hudson from Stony Point. And then in 1988, you can see here, it was flown in from Richfield, Ohio on the world's largest transport plane. So pretty crazy. And the tallest tree ever was in 1999. It was 100 feet tall. It's kind of hard to tell the different heights in the photos, but this is that 1999 tree. The second tallest tree was a little more recent. It was in 2016, and that was 94 feet. And it took 30 men to get that 94 foot tall tree standing up straight. Here's a photo of the 2001 tree. I mentioned the tree really serving as a patriotic symbol during the World Wars. And after 9/11, it was decorated in red, white, and blue again. Today, as I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, in a typical year, the tree attracts more than 25 million people. It's decorated with 50,000 multicolored lights that are strung on a 5-mile long wire. And actually, when the lights twinkle, that is being done by a computer program that took engineers 3 months to build. And since 2007, the tree has used LED lights, and they use 1,200 fewer kilowatts of electricity per day, which is enough to power a 2,000 square foot home for an entire month. The tree's also powered by hundreds of solar panels atop the different Rockefeller Center buildings. Now, from 2004 to 2017, there was a Swarovski star that went atop the tree. It weighed 550 pounds and was 9.5 feet in diameter. It was designed by the German artist Michael Hammers, and it was adorned with 25,000 crystals and 1 million facets. But a couple years ago, in 2018, the star was redesigned by the architect Daniel Libeskind. And he was the first architect to collaborate on a Swarovski star. And he said that he was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's studies of geometric forms. And he actually worked on this design for 2 years, and he didn't even see the final product until just a couple of days before it was revealed here in this photo. Now, his star is the same diameter, 9.5 feet, but it weighs 450 more pounds. It weighs 900 pounds. And here you can see someone up on scaffolding getting it set in place. It's made of 3 million double cone crystals that radiate from 70 spikes. And here's another staple of Rockefeller Center, the Channel Gardens. Every year, the beautiful wire angels come out. There are 12 of them. They're all 8 feet tall. And they first arrived in 1969. They were designed by the sculptor Valerie Clairbout. So I want to tell you a little bit about how Rockefeller Center finds their trees. So the hunt for the perfect tree actually begins as soon as the holidays are over each year. So as soon as, New Year's is over of this year, Eric Powes, who's been the head gardener at Rockefeller Center since 2010, will start monitoring and looking for the 2021 tree. And I think this is a really fun story. So this 2017 tree that's pictured here, Eric had actually seen that tree 8 years prior to 2017 when he drove his son to a football game in State College, Pennsylvania. And he thought it looked like a great tree. And so he went back the next day and he left a note on the homeowner's door. And they got in touch with him. And so for those 8 years, he went back every year to check on the tree and see how it was doing. And eventually it got to be the Rockefeller Center tree. And that's what he does every year. He keeps tabs on more than one tree, and he regularly visits them and feeds them, checks on them, depending on how rainy the summer was, can affect the growth and whether or not it's ready. So he actually doesn't decide on the tree until September. And then he notifies the owners only in October. And here is this year's tree making its way in. This year's tree, it was an 80-year-old tree. It's 75 feet tall and 11 tons. It's a Norway spruce. And it was donated by Daddy Al's General Store in Oneonta, New York. This is the same town where last year's tree came from too. So the tree is always donated, but Rockefeller Center covers any costs associated with transportation. So the tree arrived, what you're seeing here, on November 14th. The lighting ceremony was last week, and it will stay up until January 7th. And as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, if you would like to go see the tree in person this year, you do need to make advanced reservations. And how you'll be able to see the tree is they're setting up, I'm not exactly sure where and how they look, but they're setting up socially distanced pods that can accommodate up to 4 people. And so your reservation actually only gets you 5 minutes in one of those pods to see the tree. But if you did want to go see it in person, another way you can do it is City Winery has a winery pop-up at Rockefeller Center, and from there, and it's all outdoor seating and heated. And from there you can get a view of the tree. So that's a nice option if, perhaps you were interested. And here's a photo of the crowds, which, unfortunately we won't be seeing this year, but hopefully next year. All right, so I just took you through a lot of information about giant Christmas trees. And now we're going to talk about two giant menorahs. And I think this is a really fun, very New York story. So you're looking at here, Brooklyn's world's largest menorah, which is in Grand Army Plaza. So where we saw that early Christmas tree in Prospect Park, the same right near there. So this menorah first went up in 1977. It's 33.5 feet high when its center candle is added, and it's made out of 4,000 pounds of steel. And it's ceremoniously lit every night during Hanukkah. There's live music and, food stations set up. It's a lot of fun. Here you can see it in relation to the arch. And here you can see Mayor de Blasio a few years ago up there lighting that center candle. Now, this menorah considers itself the world's largest menorah. The problem is that at Manhattan's Grand Army Plaza, very coincidentally, there's another giant menorah that also considers itself the world's largest. This one is also 4,000 pounds. It actually was unveiled a few years prior in 1973. Now here's where it gets tricky. From the base to the top of both menorahs is 32 feet high, which is the maximum allowed by Jewish law. But when Brooklyn's center candle is added, it reaches 33.5 feet high, so a half feet taller than the Manhattan menorah. But these have been battling over who is the tallest. So actually last year, a rabbinical court ruled that the Manhattan menorah could in fact keep the name world's largest menorah. They hold the Guinness World Record for it. And because they were the first to use the moniker, they get to keep it. But what's funny is the Brooklyn Menorah owns the URL largestmenorah.com. So I think the feud might be not quite over. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit now. And we're going to talk about a couple of historic businesses with Christmas connections. And this will also lead us into some more literary history as relates to the holidays. So this is Rolf's German restaurant, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, on 3rd Avenue and 22nd Street. The building was built in 1840. It was originally a horse stable, and then it was a speakeasy during Prohibition. People drank upstairs while the ground level operated as a restaurant. It opened as Rolf's Restaurant, serving traditional German food in 1968. And then in 1981, the current owner, Bob Maisano, took over. And he was friends with Rolf Hoffman, so he kept all those original recipes. So if you go there to eat today, those are the recipes. But he did do something a little different, which is he started installing this completely insane Christmas display. So Rolf's gets decorated every year with 15,000 Christmas ornaments, 10,000 lights, thousands of icicles, and 800 dolls. So the whole decor is really like a Victorian style. Now this starts getting installed the last week of September, and a 6-man team works overnight because they can't work when the restaurant's open. So they work 5 days a week overnight, and they get it all up by the 1st of November. And it then stays on display until the end of April, when it's sent to a storage room in Brooklyn. Here's another image of the bar area. And every year the display changes a bit. Some things are removed, some new things are added, things are placed in different locations. So it's not always exactly the same. And it supposedly costs the restaurant between $60,000 and $65,000 every year to put this display on. But I always tell my tours when we walk by here, if you see the lines to get in around the holidays, I'm sure they're definitely making that up and more. I always try to take my tours inside. I've actually purposely scheduled them early enough so that we reach Rolf's before they open, but I've never been allowed to go in. And a couple of times the line started getting a little angry, thinking we were cutting. But if you ever did want to see the display, they have a pretty big window out front and you can look in and get a good look. But I also recommend going in March or April, which is what I did. And you can get some really nice photos. If you go during the day, there probably aren't a lot of people inside. Here's another photo where you can see some of the close-up decorations like the dolls I mentioned. And just a few blocks away from Rolf's is Pete's Tavern. This is on Irving Place, the corner of Irving Place and 18th Street. And it is famous for two things. It's famous for being where O. Henry wrote The Gift of the Magi, which we'll get to. And it's also famous for being New York City's oldest bar. Now, I always am quick to say on my tours, before anyone gets angry, I know that there is discrepancy with McSorley's, and I'll tell you the difference, and I'll let you decide which is actually New York City's oldest bar. But so this building was built in 1829 as the Portman Hotel. And then in 1851, the first business to open here was a liquor store. It didn't actually become a tavern and bar until 1864. And it has remained in operation as a bar and restaurant ever since 1864. McSorley's did it open earlier in 1854, but there are some gaps in the records that don't show it operating every single year. So that's the discrepancy. And like I said, I leave it to you to decide what is actually New York City's oldest bar. But nonetheless, in 1899, the restaurant was bought by Tom and John Healy, and it became known as Healy's. And not only was it a restaurant, but there was lodging upstairs, and there were even stables for horses along 18th Street. I think I have a photo and a few slides where you can kind of see where those stables were. It's actually now an extension of the dining room. But it was at this time that O. Henry lived nearby in a boarding house at 55 Irving Place. And this is what the bar would have looked like at the time. And actually, when I show you some modern day photos, you'll see that it really has not changed at all. And here's a view of the building where O. Henry lived. And it said that he spent many hours at the tavern, and he always dined in the first booth by the side doors. So if you go to Pete's today, this is that booth. It's now a shrine to O. Henry. There's all kinds of fun memorabilia and, copies of letters that he wrote at the time. And I will tell you that when I was first doing research for this tour, I sat at the bar at Pete's Tavern and waited for this booth to become available for, I think, 2 hours in the name of research. I think the owners thought I was a little crazy, but it was fun. So O. Henry mentioned Healy's, as it was called at the time, in his short story, The Lost Blend. He changed it to Keneally's, but it was the same restaurant. And in 1905, while he was dining here in this booth, he wrote The Gift of the Magi. As I'm sure most of you know, this is the holiday tale of two poor lovers who sell their prized possessions to buy their spouses a gift. So the wife sells her beautiful hair and therefore can't use the beautiful bejeweled comb that her husband buys her. And the husband sells his luxury watch to be able to afford the comb and therefore can't use the wallet chain that his wife bought him. The story was published in 1905 in the magazine The New York Sunday World, and the following year it became part of O. Henry's short story collection, The 4 Million. So a little non-holiday history, but interesting history, is that Pete's Tavern is the only bar that remained legally open during Prohibition. So if you're thinking that this makes no sense, it doesn't. The reason this was allowed to happen is because it was so close to Tammany Hall. And at the time, all of the New York City politicians wanted a place to drink. So they basically sanctioned Pete's, went along with it, and changed it into a florist, which you can see here. And then when you went through the refrigerator doors, that's when you were in the speakeasy. Now here's the rear dining room that I mentioned, probably would have originally been one of the stables. Everything that you see is original. And another fun fact about Pete's Tavern is that in the late 1930s, it's where Ludwig Bemelmans began writing Madeline. So he lived nearby at the time at the Hotel Irving, and it's said that he ate dinner at Pete's almost every night. And so on the back of a menu here at Pete's Tavern is where he wrote that famous first line: "In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines." So that's it. And there's a plaque as well for him that you can see. So here's Pete's Tavern today, decorated for the holidays. As I mentioned, basically everything is original. Even the light fixtures, they're the original. They've just been electrified. You can't see it in this photo, obviously, but the tin ceiling is original. The tiled floors, the bar, everything behind the bar, it's all original. And here's another image of their holiday display. And in those little archways above the liquor shelves, they're all little holiday villages that they set up. And in the windows facing the street, they also set up these fun holiday villages. So if you walk by, you can see those. So this holiday display started nearly 35 years ago with today's owner, Gary Egan. This is not, obviously quite as intense as Rolf. So this takes about 3 weeks to install everything. And now, since we're on the topic of famous writers, we're going to move and talk about Washington Irving. So Washington Irving is credited with, in 1809, being the first person to write about St. Nicholas or Santa Claus. So when I do my walking tour, I take people to the Irving House on East 17th Street in Irving Place that you're looking at to talk about this. And I say, this is the Irving House, but Washington Irving never lived here. So this is another fun New York story. So from 1892 to 1911, Elsie DeWolf and Elizabeth Marbury lived here. The New York Times called them the most fashionable lesbian couple in Victorian New York. Now, Elsie DeWolf is credited with starting the profession of interior decorating. Some of her clients included Stanford White. She worked on the Colony Club for him, Amy Vanderbilt, Anne Morgan, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Henry Clay, Adelaide Frick. So she was, a member of high society, but she was also supposedly quite the character. So there was an article in the New York Times in 1897 that talked all about the Irving House. And it was written by an anonymous writer, but it credited Elsie DeWolf with doing the interior decorating. It made all kinds of things up, saying that Irving conceived of the house himself. He was very particular about the decorations. And people didn't think a whole lot of it until 1927, when a petition was started to actually turn this house into a Washington Irving museum. And at that point, Irving's nieces and nephews started sending letters saying Washington Irving never even crossed the front door of this house. He had a nephew who lived a few doors down, who he might have visited once or twice, but he definitely never even entered this home. And throughout that whole debacle, Elsie DeWolf, she was still a pretty prominent member of society, of course, remained curiously silent. Still not really known how the story got started. But if you look, well, you can't really see in this photo too well, but in between that white bay window and the cast iron entry portico there's a plaque all about Washington Irving. It was put up in 1934 by a sculpture student. And, even though that whole issue about his nieces and nephews came out, when this plaque went up, I think people didn't remember it, and it kind of really cemented this as the Washington Irving House. So that's a fun story, which lets us segue into Washington Irving's connection to Christmas. So in early America, Christmas was kind of frowned upon, especially in places like New England, because of the ties that it had to the pagan holiday Saturnalia that once occupied the same place on the calendar. And that holiday was considered rowdy. It was associated with a lot of drinking. So people were a little bit skeptical. But in the early 19th century, a series of writers and poets and illustrators who we're going to talk about now are really credited with changing that and creating the version of Santa Claus that we know today. Now, interestingly, St. Nicholas is New York's patron saint. The Dutch ship that brought the first settlers to Manhattan was named for St. Nicholas, who was the patron saint of Old Amsterdam as well as children. So it was long a Dutch tradition for children to get presents on St. Nicholas Day, December 6th. And those presents were often left in their shoes or stockings for them to find in the morning. So once the Dutch first came over to New York, then New Amsterdam, all the children of non-Dutch families started seeing how well these kids were making out, and they started complaining to their parents. So these children, they started getting presents on Christmas Day instead, St. Nicholas Day. And that's really how that tradition began. So in 1809, Washington Irving wrote about Santa Claus. He referred to him as Sinterklaas, which is the Dutch form of the word. It eventually got anglicized to Santa Claus. In his 1809 Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York. And this is what he said. He referred to, quote, a pipe-smoking Sinterklaas rode through the skies in a flying horse and wagon and went down chimneys to deliver presents to good girls and boys. So that's kind of the whole connection there and how that began. Now, the kind of more, I guess I'll say the more novelty version of this, we can credit to Clement Clarke Moore when he wrote The Night Before Christmas in 1822. So Clement Clarke Moore's family estate was in present-day Chelsea. His home that you're looking at a drawing of was at 23rd Street and 9th Avenue, which was actually considered kind of the backwoods of the city at the time. He wrote The Night Before Christmas in 1822, and he wrote it for his 6 children. And it said that he really had no intention of adding to this whole Santa Claus phenomenon. But it was published anonymously the following year in a Troy, New York newspaper. That's how it got out. But he interestingly was not revealed as the author until the 1830s. But it said that he came up with the poem on a snowy day while riding around Chelsea in his sleigh on the way to the market to buy a turkey. And it's also said that his version of Santa Claus was modeled after the family's jovial Dutch handyman. So it is Clement Clarke Moore who made the number of Santa's reindeers 8 and gave them their names. And it's said that with the publication and popularity of this story, that's when this whole tradition of gift giving and the commercialization of gift giving really began. But what about how Santa Claus looks? This we can credit to the great political cartoonist Thomas Nast. So throughout the first half of the 19th century, Santa didn't really have a single identity. For example, there are drawings of him where he looks like George Washington flying around on a broomstick. But as I mentioned, beginning in the 1860s up until about the 1890s, Thomas Nast started drawing Santa Claus for Harper's Weekly and eventually really cemented his look. So his original drawings of Santa were of a small Santa so that he could fit down chimneys. But as time went on, Santa grew and grew. And here you can see one of his drawings where Santa is full size. So he was the first to draw Santa wearing a red suit with fur lining, the first to give him a nightcap, and the first to give him that black belt with the large buckle. He often depicted Santa visiting the troops fighting the Civil War. You can see that in this image here. And by 1881, excuse me, he had published a total of 33 Christmas drawings for Harper's. So I'm going to end with this next little fun story and leave some time if anyone has questions. You know, we've just talked about Santa and who was the first to write about him and draw him. But what about the first in-store Santa? Of course, we're all thinking Macy's, right? And most people, I think, around the country probably think that, in large part, thanks to Miracle on 34th Street, which came out in 1947. But there is some debate around this. So Macy's started their in-store Santa in 1862. In 1878, so later, Edgar Department Store, which was a New England chain, it had been founded in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1878. Its founder, James Edgar, he was known as Colonel Jim. He started in 1890 dressing up as Santa Claus. He would take the train into Boston and have a suit specially made for him. So it seems that there would be no discrepancy that Macy's was the earliest, but James Edgar was portraying the fat, jolly version of Santa portrayed by Thomas Nast, whereas those very early Macy's Santas were not quite that version. So I don't know. I think it's safe to say it was Macy's. This is just a fun photo of the Macy's Santa in the 1920s. Of course, this year, the Santaland at Macy's is a virtual experience. But last year, it was the first year that Macy's actually started requiring reservations if you wanted to see Santa. So you couldn't just pop in with the kids and have them sit on Santa's lap anymore. I guess we have a little bit of time. Since we're talking about Macy's, let me just take you through a little bit of history as relates to holiday window displays, because I think this is also fun. So without a doubt, Macy's was the first department store to create a holiday window display, and they did that in 1874, so quite early on. The reason that they were able to do this is because in the late 1800s, the country was going through the Industrial Revolution, and this made large plate glass widely available. So prior to that, you couldn't have these large windows like you do. So that was really the impetus for that. And this is where the notion of window shopping was born. So that first window display in 1874 was a collection of porcelain dolls from around the world and scenes depicting Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was all at Macy's original 14th Street location. Another first credited with Macy's occurred in 1899. They were the first to showcase animated windows. And this is a drawing here of the animated windows a little bit later, but they were the first. So by the early 1900s, most of the large department store chains had locations throughout the country in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. So there started to become this competition for creating the most elaborate window displays. Here are just some, I'm not sure exactly what stores these are. They weren't noted, but here are just some early photos of holiday window displays. This is, I'm pretty sure that this is actually a photo taken on Black Friday in 1910 on 6th Avenue. That whole tradition of Black Friday actually has pretty early origins as well. And just another cool photo of the Macy's storefront in 1959. This kind of looks to me like almost like a tin awning that's been affixed to the store. And Lord & Taylor, sadly they are no more, as most of you might know. They started their window display at their Fifth Avenue store in 1914 and really became, maybe, you know, I might even say eclipsing Macy's for being famous with their holiday windows. And the reason that their holiday windows became so popular is because what they did in 1914 is they built hydraulic lofts hydraulic lifts, I should say, underneath each window. And what this did was it allowed their teams to work on the displays for much longer, create more elaborate displays, and then it allowed them to lift them all up at once in this big unveiling. So it really became a spectacle. And it was at this time that the displays started also being viewed at nighttime. So again, it now started to become, not just a shopping thing, but more of just an attraction. And Lord & Taylor was also in 1938 the first department store to create a purely decorative window display, so not based on the merchandise. Okay, so I will end there on holiday windows. And if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to answer.
You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself, whichever you prefer.
Oh, I have a question.
Great.
Hear me? Maybe it's silly. What happened to the 550-pound star from the Rockefeller Center tree when they retired it?
So I'm going to preface this by saying I could be wrong, but I believe Swarovski displayed it at the Baccarat Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
They did, I know they worked with Swarovski on the space there, and I believe it might be there. Mm-hmm. But I could be wrong. I might be thinking of the fact that it was just displayed there for a time. It might not have been a permanent thing. Mm-hmm. But that is a good question. I'm going to check on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then I think we will end it. Thank you very much. This was great. The video will be up on our YouTube channel later on this week, along with all of our other tours, as I mentioned. And we hope to see you all soon.
Thanks,
everybody. Thanks, Dana. Thanks, Michelle. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Have a good night.
Take care.